The heavy wooden gavel slammed down, its sharp crack echoing through the hollow, suffocating air of the municipal courtroom. Margaret Hayes sat perfectly still, her frail, paper-thin hands clasped tightly in her lap. At 72 years old, her shoulders were stooped, carrying the invisible weight of a lifetime spent fighting battles that nobody else wanted to fight. The judge, a man with cold eyes and a pressed black robe, looked down at her from his elevated bench, shuffling a stack of foreclosure documents that represented everything she had ever loved. Across the aisle sat Richard Vance, a wealthy land developer with a slick smile and a $3,000 suit, waiting to bulldoze her home and her diner to make way for a concrete strip mall. Maggie had no lawyer. She had no family sitting in the pews behind her. The town she had fed for 40 years had turned its back, afraid of Vance's money and influence. She closed her eyes, preparing for the final ruling that would strip her of her dignity and leave her on the streets, when a sound vibrated through the floorboards. It started as a low, distant rumble, like a thunderstorm rolling in from the valley, but it grew louder, deeper, and more aggressive. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom suddenly groaned open, and a breath left the room. 3 towering men, clad in heavy, scuffed black leather adorned with the patches of a notorious motorcycle club, stepped into the aisle. The room froze in terror, but as Maggie opened her eyes and looked at the scarred, bearded faces of these massive, intimidating men, a tear broke loose and traced the deep lines of her cheek. They weren't strangers to her. They were her boys. To understand the sheer, impossible weight of this moment, you have to go back exactly 22 years to a freezing Tuesday night in November. Maggie's diner was perched on the forgotten edge of a dying Rust Belt town in Ohio, a place where the streetlights had stopped working and the factories had long since closed their doors. Maggie was 50 years old back then, a widow who poured every ounce of her broken heart into serving cheap coffee and hot meatloaf to the weary travelers passing through. It was past midnight, the rain lashing against the diner's large front window when she saw them. 3 boys, shivering and huddled beneath a dripping aluminum awning near the dumpsters. They were soaked to the bone, their clothes little more than dirty rags. The oldest looked maybe 12, fiercely shielding the younger 2, who couldn't have been older than 8 and 9. Maggie didn't call the police. She knew what the system did to boys like this in their county. Instead, she walked out into the freezing rain, holding a massive umbrella and a thermos of hot cocoa. The oldest boy had pulled a rusted pocket knife on her, his eyes wild and terrified, like a cornered wolf protecting its pack. Maggie hadn't flinched. She gently pushed the blade down with her bare hand, looked him dead in the eye, and told him that if he was going to stab her, he'd have to do it after they came inside and ate a warm meal, because nobody was dying of pneumonia on her property. That night changed the trajectory of 4 lives forever. The oldest was Leo, a boy with a jaw permanently clenched and a heart completely walled off. The middle boy was Jax, hyperactive, angry at the world, and prone to breaking things just to see how they worked. The youngest was Sam, who hadn't spoken a single word since they had run away from a notoriously abusive foster home 3 counties over. They were brothers, not by blood, but by the shared trauma of a world that had thrown them away. Maggie didn't just give them a meal, she gave them a home. She converted the large storage room above the diner into a bedroom, bought them heavy winter coats from the thrift store, and marched them down to the local school to enroll them. The town thought she was insane. The local sheriff, a corrupt and bitter man named Thomas Vance, the father of the very man currently trying to take her land, had come to the diner multiple times, threatening to drag the boys back to the state facility. Maggie had stood on her front porch with a 12-gauge shotgun resting casually in the crook of her arm, smiling sweetly as she informed Sheriff Vance that she had officially filed for emergency foster custody, and if he stepped a single boot on her porch without a warrant, she'd blow his patrol car all the way to the state line. Raising the boys was a brutal, beautiful struggle. There were nights Maggie cried herself to sleep out of sheer exhaustion. Jax would get into fights at school, unleashing years of pent-up rage on anyone who looked at him wrong. Leo was constantly trying to hustle, getting caught stealing auto parts because he felt he needed to provide for the family, unable to trust that Maggie would actually take care of them. And Sam would wake up screaming in the dead of night, haunted by night terrors that left him shaking uncontrollably. But Maggie never wavered. She instituted strict rules, endless chores, and boundless, unconditional love. When Jax got suspended for fighting, she didn't yell. She handed him a toolbox and taught him how to rebuild the diner's broken industrial refrigerator, channeling his anger into his hands. When Leo got caught stealing, she made him work off the debt at the local mechanic shop, teaching him the value of an honest day's labor and showing him that a real man builds things up instead of taking them down. And for Sam, she simply sat by his bed every single night, holding his small, trembling hand until the dawn broke, whispering stories of courage until the silence slowly left his soul. It took 3 years before Sam finally spoke. His first word, uttered softly over a plate of Sunday morning pancakes, was simply Mom. Maggie had dropped a whole carton of eggs on the floor and wept. They became a family, forged in the fires of survival and bound by a loyalty that defied biology. As the boys grew into towering, strong young men, they transformed the diner. Leo managed the books and the suppliers, his sharp mind keeping them out of the red. Jax fixed every broken pipe, engine, and roof shingle, turning into a master mechanic. Sam, quiet but intensely observant, became the peacekeeper, ensuring nobody ever disrespected Maggie in her own establishment. They were a force of nature, but the town never truly accepted them. To the wealthy locals, they were always just the street rats Maggie took in, destined for prison. And the local authorities, particularly the Vance family, never stopped holding a grudge against the woman who defied them. Sheriff Vance's son, Richard, was a privileged, arrogant teenager who constantly provoked the boys. One summer evening, when Leo was 17, Richard Vance and his friends had cornered Sam behind the diner, mocking him and throwing rocks. Leo and Jax had descended on them like a thunderstorm, leaving Richard with a broken nose and a shattered ego. Maggie had grounded her boys for a month, but secretly, she had patched their bruised knuckles with a fierce, quiet pride. She thought they were safe. She thought they had finally built a fortress that the world couldn't tear down. But the real world doesn't care about fairy tales, and the first major twist in Maggie's life came crashing down a week after Leo's 18th birthday. Maggie had fallen severely ill with a respiratory infection that turned into aggressive pneumonia. Without health insurance, the medical bills piled up at a staggering rate. The diner, already running on razor-thin margins, was suddenly facing a mountain of debt. The bank threatened foreclosure. Maggie, bedridden and struggling to breathe, didn't know how bad it was because the boys hid the letters from her. They took on extra shifts, worked themselves to the bone, but it wasn't enough. The local bank manager, a close friend of the Vance family, refused any extension. Faced with the reality of Maggie losing her home and her life, the boys made a desperate, silent pact. They knew of a shady, dangerous loan shark operating out of the city, a man connected to an underground motorcycle syndicate. Leo, willing to sacrifice his own soul to save the woman who gave him one, borrowed the money under his own name, putting his life up as collateral. He paid the hospital, he paid the bank, and he secured the deed to the diner in Maggie's name. But the debt came with a heavy, immediate price. The syndicate demanded labor, dangerous labor. If the boys stayed, they would bring a world of violence and crime right to Maggie's doorstep. If the authorities found out, Maggie could be charged as an accomplice for harboring them. So, they made the most agonizing decision of their lives. On a Tuesday morning, exactly 10 years after she had taken them in, Maggie woke up feeling better, eager to make them breakfast. She walked out to the kitchen, but the house was completely silent. On the kitchen counter sat a freshly brewed pot of coffee, a stack of paid medical bills, the clear deed to the diner, and a single, tear-stained note written in Leo's handwriting. "We love you too much to let our demons destroy your angel. We have to go. Don't look for us. You saved us, Mom. Now it's our turn to save you." Maggie had run out into the street, screaming their names into the empty dawn, but they were gone. Just like that, the vibrant, chaotic, loving home was plunged into a deafening silence. The town gossips whispered that the boys had finally showed their true colors, abandoning the old lady the second they were legal adults. Maggie never believed it. She kept their rooms exactly as they left them. She set 3 extra plates at the diner every Thanksgiving. She waited, but the days turned into weeks, the weeks into months, and the months into 2 brutal, agonizing decades. 20 years is a long time to wait for a ghost. Over those 2 decades, Maggie aged. Her fiery spirit remained, but her body betrayed her. The diner fell into disrepair, the paint peeling, the neon sign flickering and finally burning out. The Rust Belt town continued to decay until Richard Vance, now a powerful, ruthless land developer, swooped in. He began buying up the town block by block, tearing down the history to build cheap, soulless commercial centers. He wanted Maggie's block. It was the prime location for a massive new highway exit project. But Maggie refused to sell. It wasn't about the money. It was about the beacon. She firmly believed that if she tore the diner down, her boys wouldn't know where to find her when they finally came home. Vance was furious. He remembered the broken nose. He remembered the humiliation. He decided to destroy her legally. Vance dug into the town's archive property lines and found a 60-year-old zoning loophole, combined with unpaid, heavily fabricated municipal fines that he bribed the local council to suddenly enforce. He slapped Maggie with a mountain of legal injunctions and astronomical daily penalties she could never pay. He dragged her into court, aiming to seize the property through eminent domain and unpaid debts. This brings us back to the suffocating courtroom, with Maggie sitting alone, her spirit finally breaking. The judge had just raised his gavel to grant Vance the rights to the land, ready to order Maggie's eviction within 24 hours. Vance was smirking, adjusting his expensive tie, tasting the sweet, vindictive victory he had craved since childhood. And then, the roar of the engines tore through the morning air. When the heavy oak doors swung open, the entire courtroom gasped. The 3 men who walked in didn't look like the scared boys who had left 20 years ago. They were massive, their shoulders blocking out the light from the hallway. They wore heavy steel-toed boots, dark denim, and battered black leather cuts. On their backs was the insignia of a notorious, deeply feared motorcycle club. A club known across the state for controlling the underground. A club you did not cross unless you had a death wish. The local bailiffs instinctively reached for their sidearms, their hands trembling. The judge slammed his gavel, shouting for order, demanding to know the meaning of this interruption. Vance stood up, his face pale, shouting that this was an intimidation tactic, that these thugs needed to be arrested immediately. The 3 men ignored the screaming judge. They ignored the panicked bailiffs. They ignored Vance completely. They walked straight down the center aisle, their heavy boots echoing like drumbeats of war. They stopped right behind Maggie's wooden bench. Leo, now in his late 30s, his face hardened by years of street survival and bearing a jagged scar across his jaw, looked down at the frail woman trembling in the seat. Jax, his arms covered in intricate tattoos of engine parts and mechanical gears, stood to her left. Sam, huge and imposing, with eyes as deep and quiet as a midnight ocean, stood to her right. For a second, the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Leo slowly took off his sunglasses. He looked at Maggie, his hard, terrifying face softening into something incredibly vulnerable. He dropped to one knee, right there in the middle of the courthouse, completely indifferent to the chaos around him. He gently reached out and took Maggie's trembling, wrinkled hands in his massive, calloused ones. "I'm sorry we're late for breakfast, Mom," Leo whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Traffic was a nightmare. Maggie let out a sound that was half sob, half laugh, a sound born of 20 years of repressed grief and sudden, overwhelming joy. She reached out, her shaking hands cupping his bearded face, tracing the scar, making sure he was real. Jax knelt beside him, burying his face in Maggie's shoulder, his massive frame shaking as the old woman kissed the top of his head. Sam simply stood behind them, placing a heavy, protective hand on Maggie's back, a silent guardian finally back on his post. The judge, furious and completely oblivious to the sacred nature of the moment, slammed his gavel repeatedly. "I demand order. Bailiff, remove these gang members from my courtroom immediately. This is a legal proceeding regarding the foreclosure of the Hayes property." Leo stood up slowly, his emotional vulnerability vanishing in an instant, replaced by a cold, terrifying authority. He turned to face the judge, his presence dominating the entire room. "We aren't gang members, Your Honor. We're interested parties." Vance scoffed loudly, stepping out from behind his plaintiff's table. "Interested parties? You're a bunch of criminal bikers trying to intimidate the court. It won't work. The debts on the Hayes property are astronomical. The municipal fines alone are over $100,000. The property is being seized. You're too late, whatever you are." This was the moment the tension in the room shattered into the second major twist. Leo didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten Vance. Instead, he reached inside his heavy leather cut and pulled out a thick, immaculate manila folder. He walked up to the bailiff and handed it over, gesturing for it to be given to the judge. "You see, Your Honor," Leo said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent room. "Mr. Vance is operating under the assumption that we spent the last 20 years just riding motorcycles and getting into bar fights. But my brother Jax here is a master mechanic. He started fixing bikes. Then he started designing custom parts. Patented them." Leo gestured to Jax, who offered a cold, mocking salute to Vance. "Sam here is brilliant with logistics and real estate, and I am very good with numbers. We didn't just join a motorcycle club. We built a legitimate, multi-million-dollar logistics and custom manufacturing empire. The club? That's just our family." The judge frowned, flipping through the documents in the folder. The color slowly drained from his face as his eyes scanned the official state seals, the bank transfers, and the corporate acquisitions. 20 years ago, Leo continued, pacing slowly like a predator circling its prey. "We left this town to pay off a debt to keep that diner in our mother's name. We paid it in blood, sweat, and years of our lives. When we finally got clear, we spent the next decade building our wealth, waiting for the right moment to come back. We kept tabs. We knew Mr. Vance here was trying to steal her land." Vance's face contorted in rage. "You can't pay off the municipal fines. The city council already voted to seize the land. It's a done deal. The bank has already approved the transfer of the underlying land trust to my corporation." Leo stopped pacing. He looked directly at Vance, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across his face. This was the final, devastating reveal, the twist that had taken 20 years to architect. "We didn't pay the municipal fines, Mr. Vance," Leo said softly. "We bought the bank." The courtroom fell into absolute, stunned silence. "Take a closer look at page 4, Your Honor," Leo instructed. The judge flipped the page, his hands visibly shaking. "By God," the judge whispered, "it's a complete corporate buyout. The First National Bank of the Valley, acquired entirely by Ironclad Holdings, LLC." The judge looked up at Leo. "You're the CEO of Ironclad?" "Yes, Your Honor," Leo said. "And as the new owners of the bank that holds the municipal accounts and the land trust for this town, we conducted an immediate internal audit this morning. It turns out Mr. Vance has been illegally leveraging the bank's assets to bribe city council members to fabricate zoning violations. We have all the wire transfers. In fact, the FBI was very interested in the data Sam sent them 3 hours ago. I believe they are currently executing a search warrant at Mr. Vance's corporate headquarters." Vance stumbled backward, hitting his table. He looked like a man who had just watched his entire universe collapse. He looked at the 3 bikers, realizing too late that the street rats he had tormented as a teenager hadn't just survived the world. They had conquered it, and they had brought the entire empire back to protect their mother. The judge cleared his throat, suddenly extremely aware that he was implicated in a town council that was about to be investigated by the federal government. He banged his gavel, but this time it was weak and rushed. "Case dismissed. The injunctions against Mrs. Hayes are immediately lifted. The court is adjourned." Vance tried to sneak out the side door, but Sam moved with terrifying speed, blocking the exit. He didn't touch Vance, but he leaned down, his voice a deep, quiet rumble that only Vance could hear. "If you ever look at her again, I'll buy the ground you walk on and turn it into a swamp. Walk away." Vance scurried out the back, a broken man. The courtroom emptied out quickly, leaving only the three massive bikers and the frail old woman sitting in the front row. The tough, hardened men who struck fear into the hearts of underground syndicates and corporate billionaires alike turned back to Maggie. The intimidating aura vanished. They were just boys again, standing in front of the only person who had ever loved them. Jax knelt down, pulling a small velvet box from his pocket. He opened it to reveal a set of solid gold keys. "We brought a crew to the diner this morning, Mom. While you were here, they started the renovations. Top-of-the-line kitchen. New roof. The neon sign is getting fixed today. It's all yours. Forever." Maggie couldn't speak. Her chest heaved as she pulled all three of them into a desperate, clinging embrace. She didn't care about the bank, the money, or the victory over Vance. She buried her face in the heavy leather of their jackets, smelling the oil, the road, and the undeniable scent of home. "Why didn't you write?" she managed to whisper, hitting Leo weakly on the chest. "Why didn't you call?" Leo held her tight, resting his chin on the top of her gray hair. "Because if we heard your voice, we would have come back before it was safe. We had to build a wall so high that nobody could ever hurt you again. We're home, Mom. We're never leaving again." That evening, the dying Rust Belt town witnessed something it hadn't seen in decades. Life. The lights inside Maggie's diner were blazing brightly. Out front, three massive Harley-Davidson motorcycles were parked proudly beneath the awning, their chrome gleaming in the twilight. Inside, the diner was filled with the sounds of laughter, the clinking of coffee mugs, and the smell of hot meatloaf. Maggie was behind the counter, looking 20 years younger, a bright, radiant smile on her face as she barked orders at three towering men in leather cuts who were clumsily but happily carrying plates of food to the few bewildered but delighted locals who had wandered in. They had lost 20 years of time, but as Maggie watched her boys laughing together, she realized that true love doesn't keep a clock. It doesn't fade with absence, and it doesn't break under pressure. She had cast her bread upon the dark, freezing waters all those years ago, expecting nothing in return. But the universe has a strange way of paying its debts, and sometimes the angels sent to watch over you don't wear white wings. Sometimes they wear black leather, ride on two wheels, and carry the ferocious, unbreakable loyalty of the family chosen by heart. As Maggie poured a fresh cup of coffee, she looked out the window into the deepening night, her heart finally at peace, proving that the most powerful empire a person can ever build isn't made of money or fear, but of a mother's unconditional love.